we're going to look at the concepts of totalitarianism as it's expressed during the kind of interwar years leading up to World War II. And then we're going to do a kind of a case study on the Soviet Union and Stalinist Russia as a totalitarian regime that really emphasizes kind of the terrible nature of totalitarianism, I guess, if you will. So, totalitarianism is a relatively new concept. It comes about in the 20th century, but it's only slightly different from the old idea of a dictatorship. And so, in an old dictatorship, and I'm thinking back to Roman times here, because it's different. It's certainly different than a king and an absolute monarchy. In a dictatorship, there's kind of one person who has total power, absolute power, and it's a temporary fix. The idea is that something's gone wrong, and you need someone to come in without any opposition voice in order to solve the problems quickly, and then they'll turn over the power. It's a short-term theory of government, right? They'd be expedient. They don't have to deal with any of the bureaucracy or the red tape or anything of that sort. They just come in, they do what they want in order to fix it, and then they move on. Okay, short-term theory of government. But modern totalitarianism is different, and it really begins to seep into consciousness and existence during World War I, when everything becomes subordinate to victory, right? So nothing matters except winning, except the good of the state, and therefore it becomes a permanent theory that we should have one person who's in charge at all times in order to keep the system going in an orderly and effective manner. And so that's totalitarianism. And in that, there's the idea that the individual is less valuable than the state. So you have no meaning except as a larger part of this state, whatever it may be. You're a cog in a machine and you're interchangeable. And so there's the only way this can work is a single powerful ruler ruling literally without laws, just kind of at their whim, could be an effective ruler. Otherwise, they'd run into opposition, be that laws, opposing politicians, people who disagreed with them. And so they need to cut all of that out and just have a single ruler without laws in order to further the good of the nation. And people buy into this in general because of extreme nationalism. Like, yeah, our nation needs to be better. We need to win that war. We need to advance. We need to do whatever it is we need. So they're willing to sacrifice those freedoms in order for this concept of the greater good, of the greater need of the state. People at this time see a connection between really three nations: Italy, Germany, and the Soviet Union, and we should really add Spain in there as well. But the Italian and the Germans are fascists, and the Soviets are communists, so they're definitely different. But they do share these kind of key elements of totalitarianism. And the biggest one is kind of the idea that deviation from what the government says is standard becomes a crime. So if you're thinking or acting differently than the government wants you to, or is telling you what is correct, then that's criminal behavior. So if you're questioning the policies of Joseph Stalin, that's criminal. So they make what you and I would consider non-criminal behaviors into criminal behaviors, and the result is kind of everyone living on edge. So dictatorships outside the Soviet Union are fascists, and those are linked with reactionary movements, domestic class conflict, and then the decay of capitalism. And Marxists argue that the fascists is a way for capitalists to control the masses, and they argue, and this is the Soviet Union's argument, that through their sort of communism, the masses rise up and have control, when the reality is that there's really only one person in any totalitarian regime that has the power. But Marxists like to pretend as if that's not the case, as if the power is shared amongst the working class. So let's look at communist Russia and see what that's like. Historically setting the stage is Lenin leads the Bolsheviks to victory during the Civil War. And it's kind of a long, drawn-out, brutal civil war. It's really vicious. And recall that in addition to the Civil War, they had just fought in World War I. So things are not good in Russia. And a lot of the land had been destroyed because armies marching across it, taking provisions. And a lot of it had fallen fallow because the people who worked there had gone off to war and been killed. So this leads to a famine. In addition, all industry that existed had been destroyed in terms of these kind of competing powers battling it out and destroying factories and ripping up railroads to harass the enemy. And so, kind of on top of everybody dying and this war ripping everyone apart, people are hungry and they don't have jobs. So there's kind of this threat of open rebellion from the peasants. And so the communists and Lenin have to do something to gain control. And they had, at this point, kind of instituted the idea of communism where everything was shared equally. And that just simply wasn't going to fly, really. So in March of 1921, Lenin makes some kind of appeasements to the people. And he introduces something called the New Economic Plan, the NEP. And what this did was it granted some limited economic freedom to peasants. That is, that they didn't have like full economic freedoms, but if they grew extra food or they raised extra animals, they could go ahead and sell those surpluses. They could have small manufacturing, like clothes and things of that sort, but they were not allowed private ownership of heavy industry, railroads, banks. Those are all fully nationalized. So think of it as the small-scale economics of the day-to-day village life. Individuals could have some economic freedom there, but larger-scale operations was totally controlled by the nation. And this saw a quick recovery, and it made the peasants happy initially because they kind of got that freedom back. They weren't being oppressed and told you can only have this much, they can only have this much, you can't grow that. They got the freedom that they believed that they deserved. So initially things are going well. But then in 1924, Lenin dies, and this leaves competition between kind of his second in command, Leon Trotsky, and then up-and-coming Joseph Stalin, who compete for control of the Communist Party. Stalin eventually wins out in this competition, and it's a brutal competition, in part because he uses his office, he's third in command of the Communist Party at this point, to grant certain freedoms to minorities. So there's still nationalistic movements at the time, and so Stalin grants some limited freedoms to them, of course with the intention of taking them back, but if he can win their tacit support at first, he can become the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin also was a big proponent of just keeping this communist movement in one country, versus Trotsky who's pushing for an international communism. And so the people of the Soviet Union don't really care about this international idealistic communist movement. They're not on board with Trotsky's idea of that because they're just concerned with themselves. They don't care if people in Mexico or in Peru pick up on communism. Right? They're just worried about their own lives. And Stalin gets that, and he appeals to the immediacy of the here and the now. And so he ends up winning in this power struggle. Eventually Trotsky is expelled, and he is later assassinated. And at first Stalin really aligns himself with the moderates in order to suppress the radicals, because he knows that's how he can consolidate his power. He then later turns his back on the moderates, suppresses them, and becomes himself more radical. Stalin knows what he's doing, and he's a manipulator at heart. And so by doing this, by thinking ahead, he is able to manipulate the country and able to gain power and hold on to it. But he is immediately faced with some serious problems. Economically, the Soviet Union is behind other countries. Again, their industry had been destroyed in the Civil War, and to be honest, communism doesn't exactly facilitate the growth of industry. So he's got to figure out a way to pump up industry to keep up with other nations, especially in the mass industrialization of post-World War I Europe, when you have automobiles and airplanes and just new manufacturing that the Soviets didn't have the infrastructure in place for. And then nationally, they're faced with what your book calls the cursed problem of the peasants, and that is that peasants throughout Russian history have been naturally very resistant to change. They don't want anything to be different, and so they're used to things the way they are, and they don't really want someone in Moscow, especially Joseph Stalin, telling them what to do. They just want to live their life the way they've always done it, grow their food the way they always have, and be left peacefully in their villages. And Stalin's not on board with this. He needs their buy-in. And so what Stalin does is he flat out declares an economic war on the peasants. He says, you are going to bend to the new economic will of the Soviet Union in order for us to see success. And the way he does that is through something called collectivization, where he forces all peasants off their land into large collective holdings. So you no longer own the land you thought you owned. You now work on this field for the good of the state. And Stalin does that because he wants to use those farms to feed the industrial workers and to feed the army. And this is met, obviously, with massive resistance, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But in 1929, this is when the collectivization order takes place. They have to give up their land to the government and go work on large farms. The idea of Stalin is that he'll create basically a new country that has a strong industrialized economy and a large, strong, powerful army that can ward off any future attacks by Western European powers. Remember that the Russians had been embarrassed in both the Crimean War and in World War I, so they were needing to restore, and the Russo-Japanese War, so they were really needing to restore confidence in their army. And Stalin firmly believed that in order for this new society to come into existence, everything needed to be owned by the state. And once that had happened, then this new society would evolve. So the first act of that is the collectivization of the farms. So in a way, it's super effective by just looking at the numbers. By 1932, so 3 years after the order, 60% of peasants were on collective farms. And then by 1938, 93% of them are. So within 9 years, he gets 93% of peasants off their individual farms and into collective farms. And so in terms of numbers of people working on them, very successful. The problem is that when you take the incentive of people away, they work less hard. So before, you work on your farm, and if you make extra, or if you have anything extra, you can sell it, and you can then buy things with your extra and live a little more comfortably. So you're inclined to work harder, to produce more, to try new things in order to rise up. With Stalin's collectivization, it doesn't really matter how hard you work, you can't really move up. So your incentive to work harder is really minimal, if not non-existent. And so what you see is the number of horses, cattle, sheep, and goats falls by at least 50%. And that's a drastic drop in livestock production. And that's really, quite frankly, terrible. But the people who are hit hardest by this drastic reduction are these peasants. Because the Soviets claim all this grain, all this livestock, and they move it to the cities to feed their new industrial workers, this strong society. And at the cost of basically a forced starvation of the peasants who are working the farms until they work harder. So it's this real catch-22 where you're forced to work on a farm and you don't get anything from working harder, but if you don't work hard enough, you're going to starve. And so the peasants are really, really resistant to this collectivization. And this collectivization needs, in addition, industry to be produced, because like we mentioned before, the Soviet industry was so far behind that something had to be done. So Stalin comes up with what he calls the 5-year plans. It's a government plan for growth of the economy in 5 years. And his expectations are absurdly high. His goal is to increase total industrial output by 250%, which is an outrageously large figure that's quite frankly unattainable. He wants to increase agricultural by 150% and then force 20% of the peasants to give up their land. So step by step. And you could argue that these 5-year plans, well, they are successful. Quite frankly, they're very successful. They don't meet the goals that he had proposed necessarily. But within the time of the first 5-year plan, industry doubles. And then during the second 5-year plan, because he institutes a number of them, industry doubles again. So he is seeing 100% growth, but not 250% growth. So, it's an improvement over what the Soviet Union was, but it's certainly not great. And the reason why that they're able to see so much growth is that 33% of net income brought in was to go to be reinvested into new factories. And the government is able to force that to happen because they have total control and total planning of the economy. They don't have to worry necessarily about overhead like a private business would, because they run everything. So they can take all the money coming in, and instead of reinvesting it into more workers or whatever it may be, they can reinvest it into new factories. So we do see rapid growth. The social changes, you see that heavy sales tax is put into place, so conditions aren't improving. You can't really buy things. If you do want to buy something nice, it's so exorbitantly expensive that you're better off not buying it. The trade unions lose all their powers. In communism, the idea is that the workers all have rights already, so trade unions become unnecessary. And really, under Stalin, individuals could be sent anywhere within the Soviet Union. They had no rights at all. They couldn't resist. And if they wanted to move on their own volition, they needed permission from the state and from the police in order to do so, so that they wouldn't go stir up rebellion elsewhere. So it's really kind of a tense situation. The Soviet peasants, again, they bear the brunt of these initial changes. And life is very difficult for them at first. And another problem the Soviets face is that they lack the expertise in order to get their industry going. So they are heavily reliant on German and American engineers to come in and build the new factories. And so this kind of points towards future problems where the Soviets are unable to innovate or advance fast enough due to lack of incentives and things of that nature, where they have to bring in foreign engineers in order to compete. So Stalin is facing a lot of resistance to his new rules. And so what he does is he goes on the attack. In addition to declaring his economic war against the peasants, he straight up launches attacks on a group known as the kulaks, and those are the wealthy peasants. And so what he does, he starves the kulaks and deports them to forced labor camps. To the point where these wealthy peasants, and that would have been kind of like the village elite, right? Like the people who ran the village, they aren't even allowed onto collectivized farms. They're sent to forced labor camps in Siberia to do mining, to do mineral extraction, whatever it may be. Basically sent to their deaths. And there they are starved to death. And so the life of the kulak is really terrible. And you see that the forced collectivization, in addition to this kulak destruction, leads to approximately 10 million Russians dying. It's a really brutal time. There's not as much food being produced. The food that is being produced is going to the cities to keep order there. The last place you want to riot is in the city. If people are upset in the countryside, you can manage that. If people are upset in the city, you have problems. Revolutions start. And so Stalin and the Soviets really punish the peasants and the people living in the country at the benefit of those living in the city. 40% of the population of Kazakhstan dies during the collectivization, so he's also a direct targeting of minority groups. And then Stalin really goes after the Ukraine. And the Communist Party uses the Ukraine in order to produce food for other parts of the Soviet Union because it's such a fertile area and lots of food grows very well there. Stalin collectivizes there, but he intentionally withdraws all of the food, sending it to the Soviet Union, again, to feed the people in the army or the cities, to the point where 6 million Ukrainians die in what is called the Holodomor. It's a hunger fast. It's a hunger genocide. Really, it's an intentional extermination of the Ukrainian population. Stalin's goal is then to settle more Russians there to kind of diminish Ukrainian nationalism. And so 6 million die during this collectivization. He doesn't just target the peasants. He's in constant fear of losing his power. So he targets the people around him, having numbers of his top aides kill. Secret police would go arrest other members of the Communist Party, and they would put on these major show trials to keep people in fear of questioning anything that Stalin did. Again, the goal is that he doesn't want any dissent because he fears that he's really just feels he's in a tenuous spot and he's uncertain of his future. So he kills anyone who poses a threat to him. So secret police are arresting people and having show trials. Sometimes people just disappear, either taken to the woods and shot or sent off to the labor camps of Siberia. And so over 8 million are arrested. Millions of those are killed. He targets, again, intellectuals, party members, former army officers, and current army officers. And we'll see when we get to World War II, this is a huge problem because he kills off all the army officers with experience. And so when World War II rolls around, the Soviet army is completely inexperienced. They have no leadership ability. He kills Union officials and even ordinary citizens. Everyone is a target for him. He wants people to live in constant fear because if they are too fearful to rise up, it keeps him safe. And so that's his goal, to instill fear everywhere in the Soviet Union. And he does that by starvation, he does it by execution, he does it by arrest and show trial, the threat of re-education and forced labor camps. And so we see by the end of his reign, Stalin is responsible for about 50 million deaths within his country. It is a massive, massive number of people to have been killed. And quite frankly, it stagnates the growth of the Soviet Union, which would have grown significantly faster had it not been for Stalin and all his killings. And a way that he's able to keep the population appeased and to keep kind of things down is to win over the people in the city either through fear or through economic prosperity and through propaganda. So we'll see some examples of propaganda like this, and you see it even in the wordings. Posters would go up everywhere throughout Russia. The idea that everyone's involved in this. With shock labor, we will ensure prompt delivery of the giants of the 5-year plan. And that is, again, a 250% growth in industry and 150% in agriculture output. So kind of getting everyone on board with this mentality of we can do this, we're all in this together, but then also fear. Long live the great Stalin, with people marching and kind of these ideas that he is overseeing them all with his absolute total force. So that's kind of the rise of totalitarian Soviet Russia under Joseph Stalin.